The last time we looked at our chilies for this grow along, we pricked them out and popped them into some individual cells in this tray. And I've had a few issues myself, not with these particular plants, but with other plants. And I've also had some questions from Carl and a few other people of plants that aren't maybe looking so healthy. So one of the things we're going to do today is have a quick look at them and talk about things that might be causing some of the issues. It's really about doing a bit of detective work when you're having issues with your seedlings. And I do find that peppers and chilies and aubergines are one of those ones that can be really sensitive to changes of environments or just over underwatering and things like that. And one of the things that I found with these particular ones that I've done into soil blocks is that they've gone very pale, and also they've started losing some of their seed leaves, which is absolutely fine, but it was too early really for that to be happening. So those are signs of stress, that they aren't happy within the environment they're in, and at that point we need to work out what it is that we need to be doing differently in order to help these plants actually thrive rather than survive. The first consideration really for me was to think about the soil that they were in and the soil blocking mix that I had used. And this is one of those really finicky things, because actually the ones that I've popped into just the compost for the grow along were happier. So it's not necessarily the compost that I'm using, but it may not be necessarily that we don't have enough nutrients within this mix. It may actually be that we have too many nutrients within the mix. To begin with, seedlings have everything within that little seed that they need. So if we provide too much food, then it can actually cause them to really start to struggle and not be very happy. And then also vice versa. So as these seedlings get that little bit older, then they're going to start wanting some food. For the peat-free compost that I use, then I'd be looking at starting to either move these into a new compost, and therefore they have more food because they have more compost, or start feeding them at around the 4-week mark. For peat compost, this does usually sustain them for a little bit longer, and you'd be expecting to do this around 6 weeks. We also want to start looking at the roots and the system that we have going there, because that is often what actually tells us whether or not these plants need moving before we see any issues with any coloration. Peppers and chilies are ones that maybe don't put on as many roots as others, so this can be something that we wait for, but actually they have needed moving on that little bit earlier than other plants do. So if your seedlings have been in your compost for the 4 to 6 week period, then you may need to be looking at starting to offer them a feed. And quite often I just use a comfrey feed or a seaweed feed that I've bought, and I'm absolutely happy with that. But I am trying something a little bit different this year. So this is the first time that I've tried this, and it is recommended by a lot of people who grow chilies commercially. So that's one of the reasons I thought I would give it a bit of a go. And this is chili and pepper focus. You can get ones that are just for chilies, or you can get one that is chili and pepper. So that's the one that I've gone for, and it is actually based on seaweed along with other things as well. And you just use this every time that you're watering them, and it just gives them that slow nutritional boost that they're going to need past that point of being in the compost for that time. Another thing that I've used over the years to give them that little bit of a boost is SB Invigorator. And I first came across this product because I had issues with aphids inside the house. And if you've had that before, you'll find that one aphid becomes 100,000 before you actually turn around and see them again. And it becomes a really big problem. So I only do use this in the house. I believe it is organically certified, but they don't give you any information about what is actually in the product. So I would rather only use it inside than affect any of the bees or anything outside. And then when it comes to watering these plants, the chilies and peppers really do like to dry out before we water them again. So we don't want to keep them too well watered. So if you are watering them, particularly in the peat-free compost, then pop your finger into the pot or really lift the tray and see whether or not they actually need that water. The peat-free compost looks very dry on the top, and I'll show you what they look like in a minute, and you can see that. whereas at the bottom they are really very wet. And if we continue to water them, what we are doing is removing the oxygen from the roots, and then those roots are going to rot, and it's just not going to help the plant survive. So really, rather than little and often, it's better to give them a drink a couple of times a week, depending on the temperature of the room that you're in, and then just let them dry out again and show signs that they may be wanting to be watered. And then another thing that I've definitely struggled with this year is we are having some beautiful warm weather during the day, and therefore we haven't got our fire on. And because that's our only central heating, and these plants are in the house and they're going to remain in the house for a long time yet still, they need to be waiting until it's sort of 12 to 15 Celsius before we're looking at moving these outside into a sheltered position. So we have had a very cold house in the room that is our warmest room, that I have these plants in the window. So actually I popped a heat mat on them, but heat mats work where they usually work around 7 Celsius above the temperature of the room. So then when we had the fire going again, they were overheating, these plants. So you do need to be really careful. But I'm about 20 Celsius, I'm finding that they are a little bit cold, and sort of 22 to 25 Celsius seems to be a happy point where these are nice and green and you're actually seeing the growth on them. That can be something that's quite difficult to achieve. It's obviously very expensive to keep our houses warm at the moment. So if you have got a particularly cold room, then a heat mat can help and just sort of boost that temperature, but do keep an eye on it and make sure they don't overheat. If your house is just too cold and you can't afford to keep these plants any warmer, then move them to the warmest place that you can provide with still plenty of light. You could also move them outside during the day so they're getting plenty of light then, and probably actually it's warmer for us definitely outside right now than it is in our house. You may find that. Be careful that the sun isn't going to cook them initially, and don't let them get wet and things like that outside. So really wants to be a sheltered position where they're going to just enjoy some sunlight, but move them out slowly and get them used to that if that's your only option. I do find that moving them in and out is something that is not worth me doing, because I'll end up leaving them out there and forgetting them. But maybe you'll have better sense in that than me. And then, really, the next option is to start thinking about potting these on, particularly if they're small and they're really, really struggling. Then it may be that the compost that you've used can have way too much nutrients in it. There are a few companies that are selling seed and cutting compost with way too many nutrients in it, and it is causing issues. So now they've got some roots on it, you can move it into a multi-purpose compost, and that may help boost them as well. But otherwise we can move them into a slightly bigger pot. So you can see that these are looking quite nice and green, and I'm happy with these. They were starting to get that little bit of yellow tinge, and in the last couple of days I've just started using this feed, and you can see the difference between these ones and this one. And this is really what we're looking for, a nice green, and these ones are just a little bit sad and a little bit too yellow for my liking. These are actually ones that are on a heated bench in the polytunnel just to see how they get on, but they weren't happy in the compost. They are improving, but it is always worth just keeping an eye on those and seeing how they're doing, and we can hopefully fix any issues before it becomes something that isn't repairable. Now, these are a little bit more watered than I'd necessarily like to have a look at taking these out of the tray. You can see the tops of these are really dry, and you wouldn't know that they are particularly well watered at all, and you'd think that you'd want to add some more, but we definitely don't want to. They are heavy. I can see that they've been sat in water from the bottom, and we don't want to sit in water at any point. So using a ground peg, we should, if there's enough roots, be able to lift the entire root ball out. They ideally would be a little bit less watered in order to do this. Let's give it a go and see if we can. Yeah, no, not really. So we don't want to be ripping those roots. So this is a little bit earlier than I would necessarily be looking at taking these out. We're going to have a look and see how they're doing. So you can see that for what is quite a sizable plant, still very little roots on these. So you can see that these are definitely not ready to be potted up. If yours are looking very sad, then do pot them up. Another thing that you can find if they've been overwatered is there'll be little lumps on the leaves, and aphids can also be quite difficult to spot. They can start making the leaves go into a funny shape, so have a check under your leaves as well and see whether or not there's anything obviously there. You can squish your aphids by just between your fingers if you're willing to do that. If not, then using the SB Invigorator spray might be a good option to try. I'm not going to pot these up today, but I will show you what size of trays I'm going to pot them into next if you are at that point and you need to do this. This one isn't going to stay in here, but I'm just going to do this to give you a bit of an idea in case you're ready to do this. So just going to use some multi-purpose compost. This isn't sieved or anything like that. Make yourself a hole within it, and then holding on to the leaves if you can, just going to lower that plant back into position and pop that compost back around them. And we can go back up to the seed leaves, which is hopefully where they are, but if they've got a bit leggy, then going a little bit higher and removing those seed leaves is also an option. It will depend on how big your plant is. So that is what I would be doing if I was to be potting all of these on. I'm going to return it to the original tray because there's no issues with how they are currently. And then hopefully what you'll see by doing this is this more yellowing of the leaves will start returning to a nice green. Now I'm just going to pop this one back into this tray. If you have got a tray where maybe the compost is a little bit low, you can also add a little bit of compost onto the top, and that can offer a boost in itself. Once we have done this, these chilies, like we talked about last time, aren't overly happy in being moved and they're likely to sulk. So pop them into an area without any lights, just in sort of under a bench or something like that, and allow them just to recover with the disturbance that we've just given them. And they should pull through, and then you can put them back in sort of 12 to 24 hours to where they were before. And then one thing I'm just going to finally talk about is you can see the difference in the leaves of these. This is a much wider variety, and then these are much thinner. And these will be taller than these as well quite often. So don't worry if your plants don't look like every other person's that's putting up what is quite a dumpy, wide canopy. It's completely normal and they can look quite different.